Watch the room the first time an empath stops reaching. Picture a dinner table. The same people, the same chairs, the same conversations circling the same complaints they've circled for years. And there's one person there whose entire life has been spent leaning in, catching the tension before it lands, smoothing the edge off someone's bad mood, filling every silence before it can curdle into something uncomfortable. Their hand is always out, always extended toward whoever seems to need steadying. Except tonight, the hand stays in their lap. Someone makes a comment with a hook in it, the kind that usually sends this person scrambling to repair the mood before anyone even registers it was damaged. And they let it sit there. They don't leap to fix it. They don't explain, soothe, or apologize for a tension they didn't create. And everyone at that table feels the shift, even if nobody can put words to it. Something that used to be reaching toward them has gone quiet, and the quiet is louder than anything that's been said all night. This is the moment I want to talk about. What happens in the room, and what happens inside the person when an empath finally stops pleasing everyone. Because from the outside it looks like one thing, and underneath it's almost the opposite of what everyone assumes they're seeing. Carl Jung spent a career watching people arrive at exactly this threshold and get completely misread by everyone around them, sometimes including themselves. He noticed a pattern that repeated so reliably, he came to trust it more than the stories people told about their own lives. When someone who has organized their whole existence around keeping others comfortable finally stops, the people around them almost universally interpret it as decline, as coldness, as something going wrong. And Jung recognized that in most cases, it was the first genuinely healthy thing that person had done in decades. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung understood about this exact moment, why the pleasing started in the first place, and how it stopped being a choice and became a mask fused to the face. What actually happens when the mask comes off, both to the person wearing it and to everyone who'd grown dependent on it. And why the reaction of the people around them, the guilt, the accusations, the sudden concern for their well-being, tells you far more than it first appears. Let me start with what everyone sees, because the outside view is where the misunderstanding lives. From the outside, they've changed. Family members say it first, usually to each other before they say it to the person directly. Something's different. They've gotten distant. They used to be so warm, and now there's this wall. Friends notice that the texts come slower, that the automatic yes has become a pause, that the person who used to drop everything now sometimes just doesn't. The people who benefited most from the old version are, predictably, the most alarmed. They frame it as concern. They ask if everything's okay in a tone that isn't really asking. And underneath the concern is a question nobody says out loud. Where did my person go? The one who used to make my life easier. What none of them can see is the child who learned to do this before they had language for it. Jung understood that the personality most people show the world isn't the whole person. He called the outward-facing version the persona, the mask we build to meet what the world seems to require of us. Everyone has one. It's not a defect. It's how we function in a social world. But the persona becomes a trap when someone identifies with it so completely that they forget it's a mask at all. And for the person who spent childhood learning that their safety depended on other people's moods, the persona doesn't just get built, it gets welded on. Think about how this actually forms. A small child in a home where the emotional weather is unpredictable learns very quickly that reading the room isn't optional. They study the micro shifts in a parent's face. They learn which version of themselves gets warmth and which version gets silence, or worse. They discover, long before they could explain it, that if they can sense the storm coming and adjust themselves in time, they can sometimes prevent it. so they become exquisitely attuned. They become the one who manages everyone's feelings, because managing everyone's feelings is how they stay safe. That's the origin of the reaching hand. It didn't start as generosity. It started as a survival calculation, so young and so automatic that it never felt like a decision. And here's the part that gets lost. The child was praised for it. Adults love a child who's easy, accommodating, tuned to their needs. So the strategy that began in fear got reinforced by approval, and the two braided together until the person couldn't tell where their genuine kindness ended and their fear of being unloved began. By adulthood, the pleasing has become who they are. They don't experience it as a choice. Someone needs something, the yes is already out of their mouth. Someone's upset, they're already moving to fix it. Their own preferences have become so faint they can barely detect them, because for their entire life, detecting their own needs was less important than detecting everyone else's. They'll tell you they don't know what they want for dinner, where they'd like to go, what they actually think about almost anything, because the machinery that would answer those questions was never allowed to develop. It was too busy scanning the room. And the people in their life adapted to this. This is the piece almost nobody examines. When one person in a system takes responsibility for everyone's comfort, the whole system reorganizes around that arrangement. Others learn they don't have to manage their own moods because someone else will do it for them. They learn they don't have to notice the empath's needs because the empath never brings them up. The relationship, the family, the friendship, it calibrates itself to a permanently open hand. Everyone comes to expect that the hand will be there, extended, ready, every single time. So when the hand finally comes back to rest, the system doesn't just feel a change, it feels a threat. Jung watched this happen and named something crucial about it. The people who react most strongly to someone's transformation are rarely reacting to the person. They're reacting to the loss of a function that person used to perform for them. It looks like they're worried about you. Often they're worried about themselves, about who's going to absorb the tension now, who's going to make the peace, who's going to do the emotional labor that kept everyone comfortable without ever having to acknowledge it was labor at all. But we're getting ahead of the story. Before the hand comes down, there's usually a long stretch where the person can feel something is wrong but can't name it. This is where the real motif of this whole process lives. The slow, creeping exhaustion of a person who has spent decades giving from a reserve they never allowed themselves to refill. They start to notice that they're tired in a way sleep doesn't touch, that gatherings they used to enjoy now leave them hollow, that they'll spend an entire evening tending to everyone else and drive home feeling like they've been scraped out from the inside. They start to feel a flicker of something they'd never permitted before, resentment. And the resentment terrifies them, because the whole identity was built on being the one who gives freely, without keeping score. To feel resentment is to discover you were keeping score all along. You just weren't allowed to look at the ledger. Jung would have recognized this exhaustion as the psyche withdrawing its energy from a structure that has outlived its purpose. The pleasing kept them safe as a child. It earned them love or something that resembled love. But somewhere along the way, it stopped protecting them and started slowly consuming them. And some deeper part of the self, the part Jung was most interested in, began pulling its investment out of the whole arrangement. The tiredness isn't weakness. It's the first honest signal from a self that has been overruled for 30 years and is finally refusing to keep funding a life that isn't its own. If any of this is landing a little too precisely, if you recognize the exhaustion, the faint resentment you're almost ashamed to feel, the sense that you've been performing a version of yourself for so long you're no longer sure what's underneath, then this next part matters for you specifically. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work, built for exactly this stretch, the part where you can feel the old arrangement failing, but can't yet see what's meant to replace it. It's a way to start hearing your own preferences again after years of tuning them out. The link is below this video. But stay with me, because what happens next is the part almost nobody prepares you for. The stopping, when it comes, is rarely dramatic. People imagine transformation as a grand confrontation, a door slammed, a speech delivered. Usually it's much quieter than that. It's a single moment when someone asks for something and, for the first time, the yes doesn't come automatically. There's a pause. In that pause, the person hears their own hesitation, and instead of overriding it the way they've done 10,000 times before, they let it stand, and they say no. Or they say nothing. Or they simply don't move to fix what isn't theirs to fix. That first no feels, internally, like committing a crime. The guilt that floods in is disproportionate, physical, overwhelming. Because to the nervous system that was wired in childhood, saying no isn't a boundary, it's a danger. It's a violation of the one rule that kept them safe. Every cell is screaming that they've done something unforgivable, that love is about to be withdrawn, that the storm they spent their whole life preventing is now going to break over them. And the tragedy is that the guilt feels like proof they've done something wrong, when it's actually just the alarm system of an old survival strategy going off because it's being disobeyed for the first time. Then comes the response from everyone else, and this is where it gets genuinely difficult, because the system pushes back, hard. The people who were comfortable with the old arrangement don't say, "I've noticed you've been carrying all of us for years, and I want to understand what that cost you." They say, "You've changed, and not for the better." They say, "You're being selfish." They say, "What happened to the person I used to know?" They escalate. Some of them turn the guilt up, knowing exactly which buttons used to work, because those buttons worked for decades. Others go cold, withdrawing the approval that was always the currency of the relationship, testing whether the person will fold and return to the old role just to get the warmth back. Jung saw this clearly. When someone stops performing the role a system assigned them, the system doesn't celebrate their growth. It tries to restore equilibrium, and restoring equilibrium means pulling the person back into their old shape. The pressure isn't personal, even though it feels devastatingly personal. It's structural. A family organized around one person's endless accommodation will experience that person's boundaries as a malfunction, and it will try to repair the malfunction by any means available. Guilt, anger, sudden helplessness, accusations, even a strange performative worry. "We're just concerned about you." That's really an attempt to pathologize the change so it can be managed back into compliance. This is the point where most people fold, not because they're weak, but because the pressure is enormous and the guilt is unbearable, and the loneliness of holding a new position against everyone's disapproval feels like more than a human being should have to carry. So, they apologize. They reach the hand back out. They resume the role. And the system exhales with relief and tells them how good it is to have them back, meaning how good it is to have their labor back. And the person spends the rest of their life with a quiet ache they can't explain, the ache of having glimpsed a different way of being and then talked themselves out of it. But some people can't fold. The exhaustion has gone too deep. The self has withdrawn too much of its energy from the old structure to fund a return. And those people cross into the hardest and most important stretch of the whole process, the part where they have to look at something about themselves that the persona was specifically designed to hide. Here's the uncomfortable truth Jung wouldn't let his patients avoid. The pleasing was never purely selfless. That's the story it told about itself, but it wasn't the whole story. Underneath the generosity was a transaction the person could never admit to, because admitting it would have shattered the identity they'd built. The endless giving was also a way to make themselves indispensable, a way to secure love they didn't believe they could earn just by existing, a way to stay in control of relationships by being the one everyone needed, a way to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of being seen, because if you're always the one giving, no one ever gets close enough to see what you're actually hiding underneath. This is where it stops being a story about a good person surrounded by takers and becomes something more honest and more human. The empath who's finally waking up has to face their own complicity in the very dynamic that drained them. They chose the people who would take, on some level, because takers never asked them to receive, and receiving was more frightening than giving. They kept the hand extended partly because an extended hand keeps everyone at exactly the distance where they can be helped, but never truly encountered. The pleasing wasn't only a wound inflicted on them, it was also a strategy they ran and kept running because it protected them from something they were even more afraid of than exhaustion. That recognition is brutal, and Jung considered it essential, because you cannot change a pattern you refuse to take responsibility for. As long as the person stays in the story where they're simply the good one who was surrounded by users, they remain a victim of their own life, and victims can't change anything. They can only wait for other people to change first. The moment they see their own hand in the arrangement, everything shifts. Now it's theirs to work with. Now the same capacity that built the pleasing can be turned toward building something real. And what dies in this process is the persona itself. Jung was direct about the fact that this feels like a death, because it is one. The accommodating self, the one everyone loved, the one that earned approval and kept the peace and never asked for anything, that self has to be allowed to fall away. And falling away, it takes the whole identity with it. The person is left standing in a strange, disorienting emptiness, no longer who they were, and not yet sure who they're becoming. They've stopped performing, but they don't yet have anything authentic to put in the performance's place, because the authentic self was buried so early that meeting it feels like being introduced to a stranger who happens to live inside your own skin. This is the loneliest part of the entire crossing, not the conflict with others, the emptiness within. The person has laid down a self they wore their whole life, and the space where it used to be is quiet and unfamiliar and a little frightening. They catch themselves in old moments. Someone's upset, and the machinery starts to whir, the hand starts to lift, and they have to consciously choose not to reach, and the not reaching feels wrong even when they know it's right. There's no map for this. Jung called the larger process individuation, the slow work of becoming the person you actually are, rather than the person you were shaped into being. And he was honest that it moves through exactly this kind of empty, undefined territory before it arrives anywhere. What makes the emptiness bearable is understanding what it's actually for. The space where the persona used to be isn't a void that means something's gone wrong. It's the ground being cleared. For the entire time the pleasing ran the show, there was no room for the person's real preferences, real opinions, real desires, because every ounce of attention was pointed outward, monitoring everyone else. Now, for the first time, the attention has nowhere external to go, and slowly, awkwardly, in fits and starts, it begins to turn inward. The person starts to notice, faintly, what they actually want, what they actually think, what they actually feel, before they've translated it into what would be most acceptable to everyone around them. At first, these signals are almost too quiet to catch. Decades of being overruled leave the inner voice barely audible. Someone asks what they'd like to do, and the honest answer arrives a half-second before the accommodating one. And for the first time, they learn to catch that half-second and speak from it. It's clumsy. They'll overcorrect, sometimes saying no to things they actually want, just to prove to themselves they can. They'll swing from total accommodation to a kind of brittle self-protection, before finding, eventually, a middle where they can give freely and also keep some for themselves. This awkward, non-linear fumbling isn't a sign they're doing it wrong. It's what learning to be a self after a lifetime of being a mirror actually looks like. And here's what starts to happen in their relationships, which is the part that finally reframes everything the people around them were saying. Some relationships collapse. There's no way around this, and Jung didn't pretend otherwise. The connections that were built entirely on the person's willingness to give without receiving have nothing left to stand on once the giving becomes conditional. Those relationships were never really relationships in the fullest sense. They were arrangements, and the arrangement was the only thing holding them together. When the accommodation stops, they dissolve, and the person has to grieve the loss of connections they thought were love, and are now discovering were closer to employment. But other relationships deepen in ways the person never thought possible, because for the first time, they're actually present in them instead of performing them. When they say yes now, it's a real yes, and the other person can feel the difference. When they disagree, and the relationship survives it. And every time it survives a moment of honesty, it gets a little more solid, a little more real. They discover that the people who genuinely love them don't need them to be endlessly accommodating. That some people, it turns out, actually wanted to know the real person all along, and were quietly waiting for them to show up. Those relationships were being starved by the persona just as much as the person was. The people who accused them of getting cold were, in almost every case, describing the withdrawal of a service, not the death of a heart. And here's the strange thing Jung noticed about people who complete this process. They often become more compassionate, not less. But it's a different quality of compassion. Before, their care was compulsive. They had to fix your feelings because your feelings threatened their safety. Now, their care is chosen. They can sit with you in your pain without needing to rush in and make it stop, because your pain no longer sets off their alarm system. That's a deeper, steadier presence than the frantic caretaking ever was. It just doesn't look as useful to people who only valued them for what they do. There's a specific kind of freedom that arrives on the other side of this, and it isn't the freedom people imagine. It isn't becoming hard or stopping caring or building a wall. It's something quieter. It's the freedom of no longer being at the mercy of everyone else's moods. The empath spent their whole life as an instrument that other people played. Someone walks in angry, and the empath's whole nervous system reorganizes around that anger. When they stop pleasing, they slowly reclaim the ability to feel someone else's storm without becoming it. They can register that you're upset and still remain themselves. That's not detachment. It's the first time they've ever had a self solid enough to stand next to someone else's weather without being blown over by it. Jung believed this was the whole point of the difficult crossing. Not to make someone selfish, but to give them, for the first time, a self to be generous from. You cannot truly give from a place that's empty. You can only bleed. Everything the pleaser called generosity was, underneath, a slow bleeding out, and the people who benefited from it mistook the bleeding for love and encouraged more of it. Real generosity requires a full reserve and a clear boundary, the capacity to give and the capacity to stop giving, both available, both chosen. The person who's crossed through this comes out able to give more genuinely than they ever could before, precisely because they can also refuse. If you're somewhere inside this process right now, if you've started saying no and are drowning in the guilt of it, or if you're standing in that empty space where the old self used to be and haven't yet met whoever's coming next, I want to point you back toward that guide one more time, because this is exactly the terrain it was made for. True self-discovery isn't about becoming someone new. It's a set of reflections designed to help you hear the self that's been underneath the pleasing all along, the one that got overruled so early you forgot it was there. 24 exercises to walk with you through the disorientation instead of rushing you past it. You'll find it linked below. Let me say something directly to you now, if you're the one this is happening to. The guilt you feel when you stop reaching for everyone is not a moral signal. It's an old alarm, installed when you were too young to install anything yourself, going off because you're finally doing something it was designed to prevent. It will feel like proof that you're becoming a bad person. It's actually the sound of a survival strategy losing its grip on a life it was never entitled to run forever. The guilt fades. It fades slowly and it fades unevenly, but it fades, and what grows in its place is something you've probably never felt before: the quiet, steadying sense of being on your own side. The people who tell you you've changed are telling the truth. You have. What they leave out is that the version of you they're mourning was a version that was quietly costing you your life. They're not wrong that something's gone. They're only wrong about what it was. What's gone is the open hand that everyone could reach into whenever they needed something, and its absence feels to them like a loss. To you, eventually, it will feel like the first thing that was ever fully yours. And you're allowed to grieve the relationships that don't survive this. It's real loss, and pretending it doesn't hurt is just another form of the performance. Some people you love genuinely cannot meet you in your wholeness because they only ever knew you as a function. Letting them go doesn't make you cold, it makes you honest, and the space they leave behind, painful as it is the same space where people who can actually know you will finally be able to get in. Now let me bring you back to that dinner table, because it looks completely different once you understand what you're seeing. The person sitting there with their hands in their lap, letting the barbed comment go unrepaired, is not shutting down. They're not getting cold. They're not the tragedy their family whispers about in the kitchen afterward. They're doing something that took them their entire life to become capable of. They're feeling the whole room, every current of tension, every unspoken need, every familiar dynamic pulling at them to jump in and fix it. And for the first time, they're choosing not to disappear into it. The reaching hand isn't gone because the heart went cold. It's resting because the heart finally has somewhere of its own to belong to. Jung understood that this is what individuation actually looks like when it happens in an ordinary life, at an ordinary table, surrounded by people who mostly can't see it. It doesn't announce itself. It looks, from the outside, like someone becoming difficult, distant, changed. And underneath the surface, it's someone becoming, maybe for the first time, a whole and separate person. No longer an extension of everyone else's needs, no longer a mirror, no longer a hand permanently extended into everyone else's life. Just a self, sitting at a table, present and real and finally at rest. The pleasing kept them safe once. It's worth honoring that. The child who learned to read every room was doing something intelligent and necessary, and that child deserves gratitude, not contempt, for getting them this far. But the strategy that saves the child imprisons the adult, and there comes a point where continuing to please isn't kindness anymore. It's just the longest way of never being known. Stopping isn't a betrayal of everyone who loved the old version. It's the beginning of offering them and yourself something far more real than the performance ever was. So if the hand is coming down for you, if you've started to feel the exhaustion, the resentment you're ashamed of, the terror of the first no, understand what you're actually standing in the middle of. You're not falling apart. You're not becoming the cold, selfish person they're accusing you of becoming. You're meeting yourself, probably for the first time since you were small enough to still know who you were before the world taught you that you had to earn your place by managing everyone else's feelings. That self is worth the discomfort of the crossing. It's worth the relationships that fall away, and the guilt that howls, and the strange emptiness where the mask used to be. Jung staked his life's work on the belief that becoming who you actually are, However lonely and disorienting the process, is the only thing that lets a person genuinely live rather than merely function. Everything else is performance, and you have performed for long enough. The hand that spent a lifetime reaching outward finally gets to rest. And in that stillness, the stillness everyone else mistakes for coldness, you'll find the thing the pleasing was always secretly keeping you from. Yourself, at last, sitting down at your own table, no longer a guest in your own life. If you haven't yet, take a look at True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, made for exactly the crossing you might be standing in right now. A way to keep listening to the self that's finally starting to speak, instead of talking yourself back into the old silence. The link is right below this video.